Your daughter-in-law has been stealing from your son's bank account for 2 years, the bank manager whispered across his desk. And those 12 words shattered everything I thought I knew about the woman my family had welcomed with open arms. I'm Frank Patterson, 65 years old, and for 3 years I'd been telling everyone how lucky my son Michael was to have found Jessica. Beautiful, charming, devoted. She seemed like the perfect wife and mother. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And what I discovered about Jessica's true nature would lead me to uncover a web of lies so complex it nearly destroyed our entire family. If you've ever had that nagging feeling that someone close to you isn't who they pretend to be, you'll understand exactly why I couldn't ignore my instincts. But let me start from the beginning, because the devil is always in the details, and Jessica's details were masterfully crafted lies. It was a Tuesday morning in early November when I first realized something was seriously wrong. I'd stopped by Michael and Jessica's house to drop off homemade soup for my grandson Tommy, who'd been fighting a cold. Michael was at work, Jessica was supposedly at her part-time job at the boutique downtown, and Tommy was at school. The house should have been empty, but Jessica's car was in the driveway. I used the spare key they'd given me for emergencies and called out as I entered. "Jessica, are you home?" No response. The house was quiet, but something felt off. The living room was immaculate as always. Jessica prided herself on keeping a perfect home, but there were papers scattered across the dining room table that caught my attention. Bank statements, credit card bills, documents with Michael's name on them, but in Jessica's handwriting in the margins. And sitting right there in plain sight was Michael's checkbook, with several checks already filled out and signed in what looked like his signature, but wasn't quite right. I should have minded my own business. I should have put the soup in the refrigerator and left. But 35 years as a high school mathematics teacher had given me a sixth sense about people who were hiding something, and every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong here. The bank statements told a disturbing story. Regular transfers from Michael's savings account to an account I didn't recognize. Checks written to cash in amounts that seemed too large for normal household expenses. Credit card charges at stores and restaurants that didn't match the family's usual spending patterns. But it was the notebook hidden under the stack of papers that really caught my attention. In Jessica's neat handwriting, I found what looked like a detailed financial plan. Not a budget for the household. This was something much more calculating. Names of family members, estimates of their net worth, notes about Michael's salary and promotion prospects, even observations about my own financial situation and the inheritance Michael might expect when his mother and I passed away. The notebook contained information that no loving daughter-in-law should know or care about. Asset valuations, retirement account balances, insurance policy details, financial intelligence that suggested someone was planning something much bigger than paying monthly bills. I photographed several pages with my phone, put everything back, exactly where I'd found it, and left the soup on the kitchen counter with a note saying I'd stopped by. Then I drove home in a state of shock, trying to process what I'd discovered. Jessica wasn't just managing Michael's finances. She was systematically studying our entire family's financial situation like a predator evaluating her prey. That evening, I called Michael under the pretense of checking on Tommy's cold. "How's my grandson feeling?" I asked, keeping my voice light and grandfatherly. "Much better, actually. Jessica made him that ginger tea remedy you taught her, and he's almost back to normal." Jessica had never learned any remedy from me. She'd always politely declined my offers to share family recipes or remedies, claiming she preferred to figure things out on her own. It was a small lie, meaningless in itself, but it was another crack in the perfect facade she'd been maintaining. "That's wonderful, son. And how are things with you and Jessica? You both seem so happy." "We are, Dad. Jessica's amazing. She's taken over all our financial management, which has been such a relief. You know how I hate dealing with bills and budgets. She's so much better with numbers than I am." My blood ran cold. Michael had a master's degree in engineering and had always been excellent with money. The idea that he needed Jessica to manage his finances was absurd, unless she'd convinced him he was incompetent, so she could take complete control of his assets. She's managing everything? I asked carefully. Everything, bank accounts, investments, bills, even my payroll direct deposit. She set up this whole system where my paychecks go into an account she monitors, and she gives me an allowance for personal expenses. It's actually really convenient. I don't have to think about money at all anymore. An allowance. My successful, educated, 32-year-old son was receiving an allowance from his wife, who controlled every penny he earned. The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. That sounds very organized, I managed to say. Jessica's incredibly organized. Sometimes I wonder what I did before I met her. You were an independent adult who managed your own life perfectly well, I wanted to say. But instead, I made supportive noises and ended the call as quickly as possible. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything I'd observed about Jessica over the past 3 years, her insistence on managing all financial matters, her detailed questions about family assets during casual conversations, her habit of steering, discussions toward money, inheritance, and long-term financial planning. The way she'd gradually isolated Michael from friends who might question her influence over him. If you've ever watched someone you love fall under the influence of a manipulator, you know exactly how helpless and frustrated I felt that night. Next morning, I called my old colleague, Bob Morrison, who worked as a supervisor at First National Bank, where Michael and Jessica did their banking. Bob and I had taught together for 10 years before he changed careers, and I trusted him completely. "Bob, I need to ask you something in confidence," I said when we met for coffee that afternoon. "It's about Michael and Jessica's accounts." Bob looked uncomfortable immediately. "Frank, you know I can't discuss customer accounts, even with family members. I'm not asking you to violate any rules. I'm asking you to tell me if there's anything about their banking that seems unusual or concerning. As Michael's father, I have a right to be worried about potential financial abuse." Bob studied my face carefully. "Why are you asking?" I told him about the papers I'd found, the notebook with family financial information, and Michael's comment about receiving an allowance from his own money. Bob's expression grew more troubled with each detail. "Frank," he said quietly, "meet me at the bank after closing time. There are some things you need to know, and this conversation never happened." That evening, Bob let me into the bank through the side entrance and led me to his supervisor's office. What he showed me in Michael's account records was worse than anything I'd imagined. For the past 2 years, Jessica had been systematically draining Michael's accounts through a series of transfers, cash withdrawals, and forged checks. Over $60,000 had disappeared from his savings and checking accounts, moved to accounts that weren't in his name and weren't joint accounts. They were in Jessica's name only. The signature on these checks doesn't match Michael's. "Signature card," Bob explained, showing me several suspicious transactions, but they were processed because Jessica has signature authority on the account, and the amounts were below our automatic review threshold. "Can you tell where the money went?" Bob pulled up account transfer records on his computer. Multiple accounts at different banks, all under Jessica's Social Security number. She's been building a significant financial portfolio that your son has no access to and probably no knowledge of. The scope of the theft was staggering. Jessica hadn't just been taking small amounts for personal expenses. She'd been conducting a systematic financial operation designed to transfer Michael's wealth to herself while keeping him completely unaware of what was happening. "There's more," Bob said grimly. "She's been using Michael's credit to secure loans and lines of credit that she's been paying off just enough to avoid default. But the debt is accumulating in his name while the borrowed money disappears into her private accounts." "How much debt?" "Nearly $40,000 across 3 different credit lines. Michael probably doesn't even know they exist. My son was being systematically robbed by his own wife, and she'd been so clever about it that he was actually grateful to her for managing his finances. The manipulation was so complete, so professionally executed, that I realized Jessica had done this before." "Bob, do you think Jessica might have experience with financial fraud?" "I think Jessica might be the most skilled financial predator I've ever encountered in 20 years of banking. The sophistication of this operation suggests she's had practice." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to investigate Jessica Thompson, or whoever she really was, with the same thoroughness I'd once used to research lesson plans and mathematical proofs. My son's future, my grandson's security, and my family's financial safety all depended on uncovering the truth about the woman we'd welcomed into our lives. I started with the basics. Jessica claimed to have grown up in Portland, Oregon, attended community college there, and worked in retail management before meeting Michael. She said her parents had died in a car accident when she was 25, leaving her with no family except a distant aunt she never spoke to. It was a perfect story, tragic enough to explain her lack of family connections, but not so dramatic as to invite detailed questions. The kind of background that would make a loving family eager to embrace her as one of their own. But when I started making phone calls to Portland area schools and employers, Jessica's story began to fall apart. Immediately, there was no record of Jessica Thompson at the community college she claimed to have attended. The retail stores where she said she'd worked had no employment records for anyone by that name. The address she'd given as her childhood home was a vacant lot that had never had a house on it. Jessica Thompson, as she'd presented herself to our family, simply didn't exist. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted has been living a complete lie, you'll understand the sick feeling I had in my stomach as I realized the woman caring for my grandson had fabricated her entire identity. But that was just the beginning. Over the next several days, I dove deeper into Jessica's background, using every research skill I'd developed over decades of teaching. What I found was terrifying. The real Jessica Thompson had died in a car accident in Oregon 12 years ago, at age 19, 5 years before the woman calling herself Jessica claimed to have met Michael. Our Jessica had stolen a dead girl's identity and had been living under her name for over a decade, but even that wasn't the full truth. Using public records databases and social media investigation techniques I'd learned from my nephew who worked in law enforcement, I began to piece together Jessica's real identity and history. Her real name was Amanda Briggs, and she had a criminal record. Fraud convictions in California and Nevada, identity theft charges in Arizona, a pattern of targeting men for financial scams that went back at least 15 years. She was a career criminal who specialized in romance fraud, identity manipulation, and systematic theft from intimate partners. And she'd been practicing her craft on my family for 3 years. The woman sleeping in my son's bed, raising my grandson, attending family dinners and holiday celebrations, was a professional con artist who'd been systematically destroying Michael's financial life, while we all told him how lucky he was to have found her. I sat in my home office at midnight, staring at printouts of Amanda Briggs' arrest records and mugshots, trying to reconcile the criminal in these photos with the sweet, devoted daughter-in-law who'd been calling me dad for 3 years. But now I understood why Jessica had always deflected personal questions, why she had no old friends or family connections, why she'd been so eager to take control of Michael's finances, and why she'd gradually isolated him from people who might notice inconsistencies in her stories. She wasn't just a thief, she was a predator who'd identified our family as her long-term target and had been executing a multi-year plan to steal everything Michael owned before disappearing with her stolen identity intact. The question now was how to expose her without destroying my son's life in the process. Michael loved her, trusted her completely, and believed she was the mother of his dreams for Tommy. Learning that his wife was a criminal who'd been robbing him blind would devastate him, but letting her continue her operation would destroy him financially and leave my grandson in the care of a woman who saw him as nothing more than a tool to maintain her cover story. I needed a plan that would protect Michael and Tommy while ensuring that Amanda Briggs faced the consequences of her crimes. And I needed to implement it before she realized I was investigating her. Because if Amanda discovered that I knew the truth about her identity, I had no doubt she would disappear immediately, taking my grandson with her and leaving Michael with nothing but debt and heartbreak. The war for my family's future was about to begin, and Amanda had no idea she was about to face an opponent who'd spent 35 years outsmarting teenagers who thought they were cleverer than their math teacher. She was about to learn that underestimating a protective grandfather was the biggest mistake of her criminal career. Armed with Amanda's real identity and criminal history, I spent the next week conducting the most thorough investigation of my life. What I discovered was a pattern of destruction that stretched across multiple states and ruined dozens of lives. Amanda Briggs wasn't just a common thief. She was a master manipulator who'd perfected the art of identity theft and long-term financial fraud. Using her previous arrest records, I was able to track down some of her earlier victims through court documents and news articles. The stories were heartbreakingly similar to what she was doing to Michael. Men who'd thought they'd found their soulmate, only to discover years later that their finances had been systematically drained by a woman who'd never loved them at all. Richard Martinez from California had lost his house, his retirement savings, and custody of his daughter after Amanda, using the name Sarah Collins at the time, had manipulated him into signing over property rights and racked up massive debts in his name. When the fraud was discovered, she'd vanished overnight, leaving him bankrupt and facing criminal charges for debts he'd never knowingly incurred. James Peterson from Nevada told a similar story when I reached him by phone. "She seemed perfect," he said, his voice hollow even 3 years after Amanda had destroyed his life. "Loving, supportive, incredible with my kids from my first marriage. She convinced me to let her manage our finances because she was so good with numbers." By the time I realized what was happening, she'd stolen over $80,000 and disappeared. My kids still ask me why Sarah left us. If you've ever wondered how someone can live with themselves after destroying so many innocent lives, you're asking the same question I was. Each victim's story followed the same pattern. Amanda would target recently divorced or widowed men with children, presenting herself as the perfect stepmother and devoted partner. She'd gradually take control of their finances, isolate them from friends and family who might ask questions, and systematically drain their assets while building criminal debt in their names. Then, when the fraud became unsustainable, she'd simply disappear and reinvent herself in a new city with a new identity. Michael was just the latest mark in a criminal career that had been running for at least 15 years. But this time she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd chosen a target whose father was too protective and too smart to be fooled by her act. The more I learned about Amanda's methods, the angrier I became. This wasn't desperation or circumstantial crime. This was calculated. Predation targeting fathers who were trying to build stable families for their children. She was stealing not just money but trust, security, and innocence from children who'd already experienced family disruption. My grandson Tommy called her Mama Jessica. He trusted her completely, loved her unconditionally, and had built his entire sense of family security around the belief that she was his real mother. When Amanda's true nature was exposed, it wouldn't just devastate Michael. It would shatter a 7-year-old boy who'd never done anything to deserve that kind of betrayal. The thought of my grandson's pain fueled my determination to expose Amanda. Before she could cause even more damage to our family, I decided to start building my case the same way Amanda had built her fraud, systematically, carefully, and with attention to every detail. I began documenting everything: her financial crimes, her identity theft, her pattern of manipulation, and most importantly, evidence that would hold up in court. My first stop was the law office of Patricia Webb, an attorney who specialized in financial crimes and family law. I'd known Patricia professionally when she'd taught business law as an adjunct at the high school, and I trusted her expertise. "Frank," Patricia said after reviewing all my evidence, "this is one of the most sophisticated fraud operations I've ever seen. Amanda Briggs has been running a multi-state criminal enterprise for years. What are my options for protecting Michael and Tommy?" Patricia spread my documentation across her conference table. "Several options, all of them complex. We can report the crimes to federal authorities. Identity theft and wire fraud across state lines make this a federal case. We can pursue civil remedies to recover the stolen money, and we can work with local police to have her arrested. But Amanda will likely disappear the moment she realizes she's been discovered. If she takes Tommy with her, you may never see your grandson again. She's done this before, abandoned the children when her cover was blown, leaving them traumatized and confused." The thought of losing Tommy forever made my chest tighten with panic. What if we approach Michael first, tell him the truth and let him confront her? Patricia shook her head. Based on what you've told me about how completely she's isolated and manipulated him, Michael probably won't believe you initially. He may even warn Amanda that someone is investigating her, which would give her time to destroy evidence and flee. We needed a strategy that would expose Amanda's crimes while protecting both Michael and Tommy from the devastating fallout. Patricia suggested what she called a controlled revelation, gathering irrefutable evidence involving law enforcement and confronting Amanda in a situation where she couldn't escape or take Tommy with her. We need to catch her in the act of committing fraud, Patricia explained, something so obvious and undeniable that even Michael will have to accept the truth immediately. Over the next several days, we developed a plan that would require precise timing and a bit of luck. But first I needed to understand exactly how extensive Amanda's current fraudulent activities were. I convinced Bob at the bank to schedule a meeting with the fraud investigation department, ostensibly to discuss general concerns about elder financial abuse, a legitimate issue that banks take very seriously. During that meeting, I was able to provide Amanda's real identity and suggest they conduct an audit of all accounts associated with either Jessica Thompson or Amanda Briggs. The audit results were shocking even to me. Amanda had been operating 5 different fraudulent accounts using variations of Jessica's stolen identity. She'd been taking cash advances on credit cards Michael didn't know existed, forging his signature on loan applications, and even using his personal information to open accounts at banks where they'd never done business. The total theft was approaching $120,000, and the fraudulent debt in Michael's name exceeded $60,000. Amanda had been so successful at her operation that she'd gotten greedy, accelerating her timeline and taking increasingly larger amounts. But her greed would be her downfall. The bank's fraud department was already flagging some of her transactions as suspicious, and they were prepared to freeze all related accounts and contact federal authorities. We just need someone to file a formal complaint to begin criminal proceedings, the fraud investigator told me. Preferably the primary victim, your son. But family members can also initiate investigations in cases of obvious financial abuse. That's when I realized we had everything we needed to destroy Amanda's operation. The question was how to do it without destroying Michael and Tommy in the process. I decided to start with Michael's best friend, Danny Rodriguez. Danny had been Michael's college roommate, best man at his wedding, and Tommy's godfather. More importantly, he was one of the few people from Michael's pre-Jessica life who still had regular contact with the family. If anyone could get through to Michael about Amanda's true nature, it would be Danny. Danny, I said when we met for coffee the next morning, I need to tell you something about Jessica that's going to be hard to believe. I showed him everything, the criminal records, the stolen identity, the bank fraud documentation, the pattern of previous victims. Danny's expression went from skepticism to shock to rage as he processed the evidence. This can't be real, he said, staring at Amanda's mugshots. Jessica isn't perfect, but she's not a criminal. She loves Michael and Tommy. Amanda Briggs loves Michael's bank account and Tommy's usefulness as cover for her operation. She's a professional con artist who's been stealing from your best friend for 3 years. Danny studied the documentation more carefully. How long have you known? 2 weeks. I've been gathering evidence and trying to figure out how to protect Michael and Tommy when this all comes out. We have to tell him immediately. I shook my head. Michael won't believe it at first. Amanda has spent 3 years convincing him that she's the best thing that ever happened to him. He'll think we're jealous or mistaken, and he might warn her that she's been exposed. So what do you suggest? We set a trap. Something that will force Amanda to reveal her true nature in front of Michael, with witnesses present and evidence he can't deny. Danny looked at me with new respect. You're talking about destroying his marriage and possibly traumatizing your grandson. Are you sure this is the right approach? The question stopped me cold. Was I doing this to protect my family, or was I letting my anger at Amanda's manipulation drive me to take revenge that might hurt the people I was trying to save? I thought about Michael's financial devastation, Tommy's inevitable trauma when Amanda eventually abandoned him, and all the future Victims, Amanda would claim if she wasn't stopped. If you've ever had to make a choice between short-term pain and long-term protection for someone you love, you'll understand the weight of this decision. Danny, Amanda is going to destroy Michael's life, whether we intervene or not. The only question is whether we let her finish her operation and disappear with everything he owns, or whether we stop her now while there's still something left to save. We spent the next hour planning what Patricia would later call the perfect fraud trap. It would require Michael's unwitting cooperation, precise timing, and Amanda's own greed to be successful. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would create an opportunity for Amanda to commit obvious, undeniable fraud in front of witnesses who could testify to what they'd seen. Something so blatant that even Michael's love for her wouldn't be able to explain it away. Danny would tell Michael that he'd received a significant settlement from a lawsuit and was looking for investment advice. He'd asked to meet with both Michael and Jessica to discuss managing a large sum of money, the kind of financial opportunity that Amanda's greed wouldn't let her resist. During that meeting, Danny would present fake documents showing a substantial cash settlement and ask Jessica's advice on managing the money. Based on her previous pattern, Amanda would try to convince Danny to let her help manage his finances, probably suggesting the same strategies she'd used to gain control of Michael's money. But we'd be recording the entire conversation, and Patricia would be present as a financial consultant Danny had hired. Amanda's attempts to gain access to Danny's fictional money would be captured on video, providing irrefutable evidence of her fraudulent intentions. "What if she doesn't take the bait?" Danny asked. "She will," I said with certainty. Amanda can't resist a financial opportunity, and she's gotten so comfortable with her Jessica identity that she's become careless. She'll see Danny's money as easy prey. We scheduled the meeting for the following Saturday afternoon at Michael and Jessica's house. Danny would arrive with Patricia, whom he'd introduce as his financial advisor. I would stop by unexpectedly, with cookies for Tommy, ensuring that multiple witnesses were present for whatever happened next. If our plan worked, Amanda would expose herself as a fraud in front of Michael, leaving him with no choice but to accept the truth about his wife's real identity and criminal activities. If our plan failed, Amanda might become suspicious and disappear before we could gather enough evidence to stop her permanently. But doing nothing wasn't an option. Amanda had already stolen over $100,000 from Michael, and she was just getting started. Left unchecked, she would eventually take everything he owned and leave him facing criminal charges for debts he'd never knowingly incurred. The trap was set. Amanda Briggs was about to discover that the grandfather she'd been dismissing as a harmless old man was actually the most dangerous opponent she'd ever faced. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. Saturday arrived with the crisp clarity of a December morning, and I felt more nervous than I had in years. Everything we'd planned depended on Amanda's predictable greed and Michael's eventual willingness to see the truth. If our trap failed, we might lose our only chance to expose her before she disappeared with everything Michael owned. I arrived at Michael's house at exactly 2:30 p.m., 30 minutes after Danny and Patricia were scheduled to begin their financial consultation with Jessica. I carried a plate of Tommy's favorite chocolate chip cookies and knocked on the door with the casual confidence of a grandfather who'd simply decided to visit his family. Michael answered, looking slightly stressed. "Dad, hi. This isn't the best time. Jessica is meeting with Danny about some investment stuff." Perfect. Amanda had taken the bait exactly as we'd predicted. "Oh, I just wanted to drop off cookies for Tommy," I said, pushing gently past Michael into the living room. "I won't stay long." The scene that greeted me was exactly what we'd hoped for. Danny was sitting on the couch with official-looking documents spread across the coffee table, while Patricia sat nearby with a legal pad, playing her role as a financial consultant perfectly. Amanda was leaning forward intently, studying the fake settlement papers with the focused attention of a predator evaluating prey. "Frank," Amanda jumped up with her practiced smile. "What a nice surprise. Danny was just telling us about his legal settlement. Isn't that exciting?" "Very exciting," I agreed, settling into the armchair where I had a clear view of everyone. "What kind of settlement?" Danny launched into the story we'd rehearsed. A workplace injury lawsuit that had resulted in a substantial cash settlement, money he needed to invest wisely for his future security. He was looking for advice on managing large sums, and Michael had suggested that Jessica's financial expertise might be helpful. "Jessica has such a gift for money management," Danny said, right on script. "Michael tells me she's completely transformed how they handle their finances." Amanda practically glowed with pride. "I do enjoy financial planning. It's all about maximizing efficiency and minimizing risk." That was rich, considering she'd been systematically stealing from Michael while accumulating massive fraudulent debt in his name. But Amanda was in full performance mode now, playing the role of the devoted wife who'd mastered family finances. "How much are we talking about?" Amanda asked, trying to sound casual but unable to hide her intense interest. "The settlement is for $450,000, Danny said. "After legal fees and taxes, I should net about $300,000. It's more money than I've ever had, and I want to make sure I handle it correctly." Amanda's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. $300,000 was more than she'd stolen from all her previous victims combined, and Danny was presenting himself as someone who needed guidance, exactly the kind of vulnerable target she specialized in exploiting. "That's a substantial sum," Amanda said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when discussing financial matters. "You'll need to be very careful about how you structure your investments and accounts." Patricia, playing her consultant role perfectly, nodded seriously. Danny specifically asked for advice on account management and fund transfers. He's concerned about security and wants to make sure his money is protected. "Oh, absolutely," Amanda agreed eagerly. "The most important thing is to diversify your holdings across multiple institutions. I could help you set up a comprehensive system, separate accounts for different investment strategies, automated transfers to maximize interest earnings, that sort of thing." Michael was listening to his wife's advice with obvious admiration, completely unaware that she was essentially describing the same techniques she'd used to steal his money. But I caught Patricia's slight nod. Amanda was walking directly into our trap. "That sounds complicated," Danny said. "I wouldn't even know where to start with setting up multiple accounts." "Oh, it's not that difficult once you understand the ROI system," Amanda said, warming to her topic. "The key is having someone you trust manage the initial setup and ongoing transfers, someone who understands how to move money efficiently without triggering unnecessary attention from banks or tax authorities." There it was. Amanda was literally describing money laundering techniques while positioning herself as the person who should control Danny's fictional fortune. Patricia was taking detailed notes, and I could see the concealed recording device Danny was wearing. "Capture every word. What would you recommend as the first step?" Danny asked. Amanda leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, if you're comfortable with it, I could help you establish the initial account structure. I have experience with this type of financial organization, and I could ensure everything is set up correctly from the beginning." "You mean you'd help me manage the money directly?" "Initially, yes, just until you're comfortable with the system. I could handle the transfers, monitor the accounts, make sure everything is optimized for growth and security." Amanda was practically salivating at the prospect of gaining control over Danny's money. "It's really the safest approach when you're dealing with such a large sum." Michael was nodding along, completely convinced that his wife was offering legitimate financial advice out of the goodness of her heart. He had no idea he was watching a master criminal pitch the same con she'd used to steal from him, but I knew this was the moment we'd been waiting for. Amanda had just offered to take control of Danny's finances, using exactly the same techniques she'd employed to defraud Michael. She'd done it in front of witnesses, and it was all being recorded. Patricia cleared her throat. "Jessica, what you're describing sounds very much like what we call financial guardianship or money management services. Are you licensed to provide those services?" The question caught Amanda off guard. For just a moment her mask slipped, and I saw a flash of the calculating predator beneath the devoted wife facade. "Oh, I'm not providing professional services," Amanda said quickly. "I'm just offering to help as a friend. Michael can tell you how much our family finances have improved since I started managing our accounts." "And how exactly do you manage Michael's accounts?" Patricia pressed. Do you have formal documentation of your authority to handle his finances? Amanda was starting to look uncomfortable. The questioning was moving into territory she hadn't expected, and Patricia's professional expertise was making her realize this wasn't the easy mark she'd anticipated. I have Michael's complete trust and authorization, Amanda said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. We're married. Spouses manage each other's finances all the time. Of course, Patricia agreed smoothly. And I'm sure Michael appreciates having someone so skilled handle his banking. What's your background in financial management, if you don't mind me asking? This was the question Amanda couldn't answer honestly without exposing her criminal history. She tried to deflect with vague mentions of community college business courses and retail management experience, but Patricia kept pressing for specifics, which, community college? What year did you graduate? What companies did you work for in management? Amanda's story began to fall apart under professional questioning. The dates didn't match, the institutions didn't exist, the work history couldn't be verified. Michael was starting to look confused as his wife struggled to provide basic information about her background. If you've ever watched someone you thought you knew try to explain obvious lies, you'll understand the sick feeling that was growing in Michael's chest. Jessica, Michael said slowly, I don't think I've ever heard you mention some of these details before. Amanda's desperation was becoming visible. She was trapped between maintaining her cover story and trying to gain access to Danny's fictional money, and the contradictions were becoming impossible to manage. That's when I decided it was time to end her charade permanently. Amanda, I said quietly, perhaps it would be easier if you just told the truth. Everyone in the room froze. Amanda's face went white as she registered that I'd used her real name, the name she'd been hiding for 3 years. I'm sorry, she said, trying to maintain her Jessica persona. My name is Jessica. I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying and spread Amanda Briggs's arrest records, mugshots, and criminal history across the coffee table, right next to Danny's fake settlement papers. Your name is Amanda Briggs, I said calmly. You're a career criminal with fraud convictions in 3 states. The real Jessica Thompson died in a car accident 12 years ago when she was 19 years old. You stole her identity and have been living under her name ever since. The silence in the room was deafening. Michael stared at the documents, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as he recognized the woman in the police photos as his wife. This is insane, Amanda said, but her voice was shaking. Frank, what are you trying to do here? I'm trying to protect my family from a criminal who's been systematically stealing from my son for 3 years. I pulled out the bank records and forged documents. You've stolen over $100,000 from Michael, forged his signature on loan applications, and accumulated $60,000 in fraudulent debt in his name. Michael picked up one of the mugshots, holding it next to Amanda's face. The resemblance was unmistakable, even accounting for changes in hair color and style over the years. Jessica, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Tell me this isn't real. Tell me there's some explanation. Amanda looked around the room desperately, realizing that her perfect con was collapsing in real time. Danny was recording everything. Patricia was a lawyer who could testify to what she'd witnessed, and I had documentation of every crime she'd committed. She had 2 choices: confess and face the consequences, or run and hope she could escape before law enforcement caught up to her. Amanda Briggs chose to run. She bolted for the door without another word, pushing past Michael and fleeing toward her car parked in the driveway. But we'd anticipated this possibility. Patricia was already on the phone with police who were waiting 2 blocks away. Amanda made it exactly 3 streets before being pulled over and arrested on multiple federal charges. Michael collapsed into his chair, staring at the evidence spread across his coffee table. 3 years, he said numbly. I've been married to a criminal for 3 years. Where's Tommy? I asked, suddenly realizing my grandson hadn't appeared during any of the confrontation at his friend's house for a sleepover. He doesn't know. Michael's voice trailed off as the full implications hit him. Oh God, Dad. Tommy calls her Mama. He loves her. How do I explain this to him? It was the question I'd been dreading most. How do you tell a 7-year-old boy that the woman he believes is his mother is actually a criminal who never loved him at all. But that conversation would have to wait. Right now, we had to deal with the immediate aftermath of Amanda's arrest and the financial devastation she'd left behind. The woman who'd seemed like the perfect daughter-in-law had destroyed my son's credit, stolen his life savings, and traumatized my grandson. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the protective instincts of a grandfather who'd spent his career outsmarting people who thought they were cleverer than their math teacher. Amanda Briggs was about to discover that her criminal career had finally met an opponent she couldn't con, manipulate, or outrun. The weeks following Amanda's arrest were a blur of federal investigators, attorneys, financial audits, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding Michael's shattered life. But perhaps the most difficult challenge was the conversation I'd been dreading since this entire nightmare began, explaining to my 7-year-old grandson that the woman he called Mama Jessica was never coming home again. Tommy returned from his sleepover on Sunday morning to find his world completely changed. Michael had spent the entire night trying to figure out how to explain the unexplainable, and when Tommy asked where Jessica was, the pain on my son's face was heartbreaking to witness. "Tommy, we need to talk about Jessica," Michael said, kneeling, down to his son's eye level. "She had to go away and she won't be living with us anymore." "Did she go to visit her aunt?" Tommy asked innocently. It was the cover story Amanda had always used to explain her occasional absences when she was scouting new targets or meeting with other criminals. Nobody. Jessica. Jessica wasn't who we thought she was. She did some very bad things and the police had to take her away. Tommy's face crumpled with confusion and fear. What kind of bad things is she hurt? How do you explain to a child that his entire sense of family security was built on lies? That the woman who tucked him in every night, helped with homework and called herself his mama was a criminal, who'd been using him as a prop in her elaborate fraud? If you've ever had to watch a child's innocence shatter in real time, you'll understand why I had to leave the room before I started crying in front of Tommy. The next several months were a masterclass in patience, therapy, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Tommy struggled to understand why Mama Jessica had left, why Daddy seemed so sad all the time, and why strangers kept coming to the house to ask questions and look at papers. But children are remarkably resilient, and with the help of an excellent family therapist, Tommy gradually began to process the truth about Amanda. We explained in age-appropriate terms that some adults pretend to be different people, and that Jessica had been pretending to be someone she wasn't. We emphasized that none of it was his fault, that he was loved completely, and that our family would heal together. Meanwhile, the legal machinery ground forward with satisfying efficiency. Amanda, no longer able to maintain her Jessica Thompson facade, was charged with identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering under federal RICO statutes. Her previous victims in California, Nevada, and Arizona testified about similar patterns of fraud, painting a picture of a career criminal who'd systematically destroyed families for over 15 years. The evidence we'd gathered was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, recorded conversations, witness testimony. Amanda's defense attorney eventually advised her to accept a plea bargain rather than face trial and risk an even harsher sentence. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. The judge noted that her systematic targeting of families with children represented a particularly cruel form of fraud that warranted significant punishment. But the legal victory was only part of our recovery. The financial damage Amanda had inflicted on Michael was extensive, and repairing it required months of working with banks, credit agencies, and federal investigators. The stolen money, over $120,000, was largely gone, spent on Amanda's previous escapes and hidden in accounts she'd established under various false identities. We recovered about $30,000 from accounts that hadn't been completely drained, but the rest was simply lost. The fraudulent debt in Michael's name was more complicated. Banks and credit companies had to be convinced that the signatures were forged, the applications were fraudulent, and Michael was a victim rather than a co-conspirator. Fortunately, Amanda's confession as part of her plea bargain helped establish Michael's innocence in most cases. But even with legal vindication, Michael's credit was destroyed, and rebuilding it would take years. He had to move out of the house he'd shared with Amanda. The mortgage payments she'd been making came from stolen money, and the property was part of the federal asset forfeiture case. For a while, Michael and Tommy moved in with me, and I got to experience the joy of having my grandson wake me up every morning and fill my too-quiet house with laughter and chaos. Michael was devastated by the betrayal, but he was also relieved to finally understand why he'd always felt slightly off balance in his marriage to Jessica. "I kept thinking I was losing my mind," he told me one evening after Tommy had gone to bed. "Jessica always seemed to know things about our finances that I didn't remember telling her. She'd refer to conversations we'd supposedly had about money management, but I couldn't remember having those discussions. That's because those conversations never happened. Amanda had been making financial decisions unilaterally and then convincing Michael that he'd agreed to them. It was a form of gaslighting so subtle and persistent that Michael had begun to doubt his own memory and judgment. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of this entire ordeal came 6 months later, when I received a phone call from Detective Sarah Martinez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. "Mr. Patterson, I wanted to update you on the Amanda Briggs investigation," she said. "Your evidence and testimony helped us identify 12 additional victims across 5 states. We've recovered over $400,000 in stolen assets, and 3 other members of her criminal network have been arrested." Amanda hadn't been working alone. She'd been part of a larger romance fraud operation that targeted middle-aged men with children, specializing in long-term cons that could drain victims' assets over several years. The evidence I'd gathered about Amanda's methods helped federal investigators unravel the entire criminal enterprise. More importantly, Detective Martinez continued, "Your intervention likely prevented Amanda from completing her exit strategy with your family. Our analysis suggests she was probably 6 to 8 weeks away from disappearing with whatever remained of Michael's assets and potentially taking Tommy with her. The thought of losing my grandson forever still makes me shudder. If I hadn't trusted my instincts about Jessica, if I hadn't investigated her background, if I hadn't been willing to risk Michael's temporary anger to protect him from permanent devastation, Amanda would have succeeded in destroying our family completely." A year later, Michael met Jennifer, a genuine widow with 2 children of her own, who'd been through her own journey of healing after loss. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, with complete transparency about their pasts and their scars. When they married 2 years later, it was a celebration not just of their love, but of their hard-won wisdom about trust, honesty, and the difference between genuine affection and calculated manipulation. Tommy, now 10, was Jennifer's ring bearer, and in his wedding speech, Michael thanked me for being the kind of father who would risk everything to protect his family, even when it meant destroying comfortable illusions and facing difficult truths. But perhaps the moment that meant the most to me came during their honeymoon, when Tommy crawled into bed with me one morning and said, "Grandpa, I'm glad you figured out that Jessica wasn't really my mom. Jennifer feels different, she feels real, out of the mouths of babes. Children have an instinct for authenticity that adults often lose, and Tommy had sensed something false about Amanda, even when he couldn't articulate what it was." 3 years after Amanda's arrest, I received a letter from her federal prison in Kentucky. She was requesting family contact information, claiming she wanted to apologize to Michael and explain her actions. The letter was forwarded through her attorney, and it was filled with self-pity and attempts to justify her crimes as the result of childhood trauma and mental illness. I threw the letter away without showing it to Michael or Tommy. Amanda Briggs had forfeited any right to contact our family when she chose to build her life on lies and theft. Her apologies were worthless, her explanations were manipulative, and her desire for contact was probably just another attempt to find new victims or gather information she could use when she was eventually released. Some people deserve forgiveness and second chances. Others have demonstrated such fundamental dishonesty and cruelty that they've earned permanent exile from the lives they've damaged. Amanda fell definitively into the second category. Today, Michael's financial recovery is nearly complete. His credit has been rebuilt. He and Jennifer have purchased a home together, and the children, Tommy and Jennifer's 2 kids, have formed the kind of blended family that actually works because it's built on truth, mutual respect, and genuine affection. I'm 70 now, and I've learned some hard lessons about trust, family, and the importance of listening to your instincts when something feels wrong. I've also learned that sometimes protecting the people you love requires destroying their comfortable illusions and forcing them to confront painful truths. If you've ever suspected that someone in your family's life isn't who they claim to be, don't ignore those feelings. If someone seems too good to be true, asks too many questions about finances, or gradually isolates your loved ones from their support systems, investigate. Trust your instincts, document everything, and don't be afraid to be the bad guy who asks uncomfortable questions. Amanda Briggs was a master manipulator who'd perfected her craft over 15 years of criminal activity. She'd destroyed dozens of families, stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and traumatized countless children who'd trusted her as a stepmother figure. But she made one crucial mistake. She chose to target a family that included a grandfather who'd spent 35 years dealing with teenagers who thought they were smarter than their math teacher. May have been 65 years old when I started investigating Jessica Thompson, but I was also a man who devoted his career to seeing through lies, detecting patterns of deception, and protecting young people from predators who wanted to harm them. Amanda discovered too late that age and experience are more powerful than youth and cunning when they're wielded by someone with nothing to lose and everything to protect. The career criminal who thought she could con an elderly school teacher learned that underestimating your opponent is the fastest way to destroy your own life. And sometimes, that's exactly the justice that family predators deserve. If this story of family protection and grandfather's intuition resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about standing up to manipulators and protecting the people you love. Share your own experiences with family deception in the comments below. Have you ever had to investigate someone your family trusted? Let us know how you handled the situation. Click the video appearing on your screen now to hear another story about uncovering dangerous lies and fighting for family truth. Thanks for watching, and remember, when someone's behavior doesn't match their words, trust your instincts and protect your loved ones no matter what it costs you.